This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. All right, welcome back everyone to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. Today I am very excited to have Adam White as a guest, and we're going to hear his story today. I have known Adam for several years. He and I have done some flying together for Cochrane Hills Bible Camp, and that's how I know him and how we're connected. And he also has a lavishingly beautiful beard, which he and I always joke about. Now, Adam, before you share, I wrote a list of everything I know about you and all the kind of the basic things. Sure. And we're going to start with those. And you can tell me where I'm wrong.
Well, I can see the list from here, and it's a little square of paper, and it's only like 5 or 6 lines. So you don't know much about me.
No, I really don't. But maybe by the end of this, I'll learn about those gaps.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So Adam White, you are a Jesus follower.
I am.
You are a husband.
Yep.
You are a father of how many?
3 daughters.
3 daughters, and I've met 1 or 2 of them. You are a missionary in Central Alaska based out of Nenana for a mission called the Master's Mission.
Correct.
You are a pilot. You have a Maule M7, which I wish I had, and you have a Cessna 206, correct. 2 very capable airplanes. You're a pastor of a small church, which meets at your hangar.
That was the case. There's been some exciting updates since then.
Okay.
And we'll dig into that as we talk, I'm sure.
Okay, interesting. You are the president of the Airmen's Association, which is like the AOPA of Alaska.
So that was true at one time. I was on the board of directors and then term limited off, but I'm still working with the Airmen's Association in a different role, not as president. So
okay. Well, you have a prominent
that is a factual
role.
Statement, not currently true, though. So
that's a good way to put it. Okay. You have a radio show on, what is the name of the station again?
So, well, it's on several stations. It's on KIAM out of Nenana, KYKD out of Bethel, KAGV out of Big Lake, and then a lot of satellite translators in different villages across the state.
So clearly you are a pilot because you can remember a lot of acronyms.
Acronyms are part of my normal vocabulary, yes.
Yes, and it is called the Bluegrass Hour.
Correct.
Which I mistakenly called the Jazz Hour or something, and you got on my case.
Yeah, you pick on me a little bit.
I pick on you a lot. Yeah. I do.
But you get it back, so you can give it and you can take it, so that's good.
Well, if you're going to give it, you have to take it.
That's true.
Okay, and that's on Saturday nights, and you can actually listen to that online. Is that right? You can.
Yep.
Okay.
So the best place to find that, Saturday nights at 6 o'clock, Alaska time. It's on the IAM radio network. Mm-hmm. But Voice for Christ Ministries is the parent organization that I guess the proper term would be syndicates the program for me. Yeah. So vfcm.org is where you can find that stuff. So
yeah, great.
Little shameless plug for that other ministry. So
yes. And I have one more, and I've already mentioned it, but you have a luscious beard, and you are the Nenana Beard Competition winner. Is that right?
I am the reigning undefeated champion.
And you told me that you competed against a 7-year-old.
I did. That was not the only competition. And I say reigning undefeated. I've won 2 years in a row, but we've only had the contest for 2 years.
Oh, yes. So. But nonetheless, you won, and it is a luscious beard. Well, won't be the last time I mention that.
I appreciate that.
Okay, so is pretty much all of that correct? Minor corrections?
Some minor corrections, but yeah. Yep.
Okay. So Adam, to get to know you, and I told you before we started recording, I want to get to the bottom of your heart and your passion. I know that your passion is the gospel for Alaska, and you use all these different avenues. You have a small church, the aviation ministry, the radio station, and the Airmen's Association. All of that coming together, and your drive is the gospel, and that's what I want to hear a lot about today.
Sure. It has definitely infiltrated all aspects of my life.
Yes.
And that was somewhat intentional, but it was also very providential to use those words. So
yeah. And you have all these unique and varied roles. And so you have an advancement of the gospel through all these various avenues, which is pretty cool. And there's one other thing that I just thought of, I did not put on my list, but you were almost a missionary in Ecuador, and we're going to get to that.
Yep.
And you told me that story a year ago, and I want to hear that again, but
Sure.
when we'll get to that. So let's start with your background. Where are you from? I know you're from the South. You might tell from his accent.
Everybody else speaks differently than me. I don't have the accent. Everybody else speaks.
Of course,
with.
yeah. That's absolutely the case.
Right. Yeah.
So let's start from your background. Where are you from?
So I was born and raised in Georgia, Northeast Georgia, relatively small town when I was raised there. It is no longer a small town. After graduating high school, I grew up, first I guess I grew up in a Christian home. Mm-hmm. However, I do remember when my father came to know the Lord.
Oh.
I was 6 years old, 5 years old maybe.
Why do you remember that?
Because I noticed a big change in my dad.
What was the change?
My dad, he's not proud of this, but he's a redeemed, saved believer, and his life was changed, and he acknowledges the power of salvation, but he struggled with alcohol. And as a 5-6-year-old kid, I knew when that was happening. And the things that he would do, the way that he would act, and then it changed.
Wow.
I remember us going to this little church. My mom grew up in a somewhat Christian family, and she thought it was important that my sister and I would go to church from time to time, and she would come with us. And again, this is very early in my life. I remember when my dad went and walked down the aisle.
Wow.
And again, very dramatic change in my dad's life when he became a Christian.
Wow. And your relationship with him since then?
I was 5 or 6 years old.
Right, right.
Every 5 and 6 year old son loves their dad. But being able to see my dad mature in his faith as I was starting to mature as a young man, seeing how he was working out his faith with fear and trembling, like the scripture tells us we're supposed to do, made a very big impression in my life.
Yeah, it sounds like your dad is one of the biggest role models in your life.
I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where is your dad now?
So my parents still live in Georgia. I kind of joke with them a little bit. They spend summers here in Alaska with us.
Oh.
And then winters in Georgia with my sister. This summer they didn't spend the whole summer with us, but they have been spending most of their summers with us here the past few years.
Oh, so, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See, there we go. Something new.
Another thing that you didn't know.
Yeah, great. Okay, so take us into your younger years. Any significant moments in your younger years?
So one of the things that was happening growing up in the church, there would be missionaries that would come through and visit. And my parents, my mom loved to entertain and to host. And so we would either have these missionaries stay with us at our house, or they would all come over for a meal, regardless of whether they were staying with us or not. And so I grew up hearing stories from missionaries from all over the world at our kitchen table. Stories of the hardships of life, the different cultures around the globe, real tangible stories of how God was working and what was going on in other parts of the world. For a young guy growing up in a very rural community in Georgia, where it was easy to think that the world was very small. But when these people would come to visit, my eyes were opened as to how big the world was.
Yeah.
And how important the gospel was.
So would you say that was kind of the root of your desire?
I would say, yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
Yeah, hearing those stories, the adventure of their life. What kid, especially a young guy growing up in a rural community, thinking of adventure, thinking of other parts of the world, the jungles, the deserts, all that kind of stuff.
It pokes at that boyish desire for adventure, to conquer the world, to save the world, whatever. Yep. It really poked that.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah. Yep. I love that story because your story is very reminiscent of mine. Growing up in a Christian home.
Sure.
I did grow up hearing about missionary stories as well. And I remember thinking that my story was boring. I was never a drug addict. I was never, I didn't have a radical conversion. It was rather tame.
Right.
But the temptation is to feel like that's a boring story. But it's the exact story that I want for my children.
Exactly.
Yep. And so that really, having children changed my perspective about it being quote unquote boring. And so I actually love hearing stories like that because it's what I want for my kids, and obviously you want for your kids.
Yeah, and it's kind of a pilot thing.
Mm-hmm.
As pilots, we want life to be boring because it's never good when a pilot's life gets exciting, because that's usually because something bad has happened or is about to happen.
Right.
And I think, Billy, I think you're absolutely right. I've struggled with that myself because I've had trials and hardships in my life. I've had struggles. I haven't had some of the larger ones that a lot of those around me in the community that I live in struggle with. And so I can't directly relate to some of those hardships and struggles.
Yeah.
But I have been able to work through what God has walked me through, knowing his power of salvation, knowing the benefits that the gospel brings, and understanding that even though I didn't need as much power to overcome those hardships and trials, it still was not something I could do on my own.
Yeah.
As little as my problems were in the grand scheme of things, I couldn't fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I couldn't fix the small, by comparison, problems in my own life, then I know that the people around me who have deeper struggles and harder issues that they're wrestling with, that there is absolutely no way they can do that on their own either.
Yeah.
And so,
well, and how many millions of young people have your story or my story that you can relate to? Because a lot of the battles are mental, right? There's not like these physical, like alcohol or like those very obvious, very blatant things. There's these inner struggles, and you understand those. And there's a lot of people who have a similar story that the drug addict who came to Christ and recovered will not understand. Does that make sense? And so we all need each other in that sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go on to like your college years. Where did you go to? Did you go to college?
I did. And so I went to LeTourneau University.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'll add that to the list.
Yeah.
Things I didn't know.
For those of you who don't know, LeTourneau University is a Christian. They call themselves the Christian Polytechnic College or University. I was intrigued by LeTourneau because it was a very hands-on engineering focus type school, specifically at that point in time when I went. And I was very interested in aviation. In high school, I was a mechanic apprentice at the local airport in my county, where I grew up. I actually was eligible to take the A&P exam, the airframe and power plant exam, when I graduated high school. I had enough work experience, but I knew that I wanted to get all of my pilot ratings, and I hadn't worked on helicopters or turbine engines, so I was kind of unsure about my capabilities there. But went to a 4-year program. Got a bachelor's of science in aviation technology at LeTourneau. So
I didn't know you had a bachelor's of science in aviation technology.
Yeah, it sounds important, but
it's not.
Yeah.
So you came out with your pilot licenses
I did.
And your A&P?
Came out with the airframe and power plant mechanic certificates, all the way up to multi-engine commercial instrument, flight instructors, all that stuff.
Okay. And is that where you met your wife? Was it in college?
No, it was not.
Oh, I don't know your wife's story, actually. This is going to be new for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we actually met.
You have told me this before. Yeah. Now I'm recalling it. Okay, go ahead.
So we actually met on the ramp at the Nenana airport.
Yes. Okay. You need to tell this story. Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess we're kind of jumping forward in years. A lot of things had happened between being at LeTourneau and then being here.
Yeah,
in Nenana.
we'll do a rewind.
Okay.
Let's jump on the wife's story.
So I was here in Nenana, flying a Cherokee 6 and maintaining that aircraft for Voice for Christ Ministries, which we've already talked a little bit about. And I was doing a lot of flights out to Bethel because the station there in Bethel, KYKD, was just become a part of this organization, Voice for Christ. And so I was doing a lot of staff shuttles and a lot of other equipment.
And At the risk of segueing to another story, you came here to work for the radio station and be a pilot for the radio station.
For the radio station.
Okay.
Yeah. To be a pilot mechanic. And so I was coming back from a trip from Bethel. It was in October. It was actually October 15th of 1995.
Well, you got the date. You're better than me with that kind of stuff.
Get out of the airplane. It's dark. I'm putting the airplane to bed, putting the wing covers back on it and everything. Well, the other staff had come out to the airport to meet me in the airplane and help me unload the airplane because I had a bunch of stuff that needed to come back here to the studios where we are right now. And I knew that this gal was coming up to work, be a volunteer here at the radio station. Had heard that she had arrived the day or two before. And I mean, you know how it is. You stick your head in the airplane, you grab a box, you turn around, and you just give it to whoever's standing there. You don't pay attention to what's going on. You got a job to do. Let's get this airplane done.
I think I did that to you today, yes.
No. So I hand this box to this gal, and I'm like, oh, you're Lindy. You're the new person here. And she didn't say anything. She's just kind of shuffling around. Well, we all come back here to the studios afterwards after I get the airplane kind of put away. And, it's dark at the ramp at the airport. I get here in the building and I'm like, wow, she's kind of cute. And as they say, the rest is history. So,
such a masculine way to tell that story. Yeah.
There's a lot of things that were orbiting around all of that at that time.
Sure.
But we met in October. We were married in July of '96.
And you've basically lived here ever since 1995?
We have. There was a short period that we went back to the lower 48 to go to school.
Yeah.
But then came back.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Okay, so let's do the rewind back to college and tell us about your time in Ecuador because this was like a really pivotal.
Wasn't pitiful, it was pivotable. Yeah.
Maybe it was both. We'll
Right.
find out.
Yeah.
Tell us about that part of your life because I know that was
Sure.
a big part of your life.
Yeah, it was. So one of the families that became very good close friends of our family were some missionaries in Ecuador.
Okay.
That would come back to the U.S. and visit supporting churches, and we would always come back to our place. And I grew up hearing stories of them working with HCJB radio, shortwave radio station in Ecuador. So our family went down when I was still in high school and went down and helped them with some projects. My dad and I rebuilt the engine in a couple of vehicles down there.
Wow.
I helped them with some work on the shortwave transmitters and did some tower work and stuff. I mean, it's just, again, adventure, foreign country.
Yeah, there's a twinkle in your eye right now. You got a little
fun.
smile because
Yeah.
like you just feel alive doing a purposeful thing
Right.
that requires skill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that relationship with that family, I now was becoming my relationship with them. Not just my parents knew them, I knew them. So I go to LeTourneau, fast forward a little bit. I graduate from LeTourneau. I never really wanted to fly for the airlines. A lot of my classmates have gone on to the airline career, and they're doing very, very well, very successful. I enjoy fixing things. I enjoy being a mechanic. I particularly really enjoy maintaining something that I operate.
Yeah.
I like fixing things. It's okay for me to enjoy fixing other people's things, but I really like maintaining the thing that I operate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Getting to know it.
You enjoy the fruit of your labor in that way.
Right. And so I always wanted to be a pilot mechanic and had thought about missionary aviation, but didn't really know much about it, didn't understand what really happened there. And for the longest time, I had heard all these stories from other missionaries, and in my mind, and this is just the way, you hear stories and you formulate this image in your mind, right? So as a young boy, I thought a missionary had a Bible in his left hand and a machete in his right hand, and he hacked trails through the jungle to bring the gospel to a tribe that had never heard it before. Now, that is a very legitimate work of a missionary. Even today, even in 2024, that still happens today. But that is not the only thing a missionary does. That is not the only thing to do that would be classified missionary work. Mm-hmm. And my relationship with the Stanleys, the family that were there at HCJB, helped me understand that there are a lot of things that need to happen in order for the gospel to make its way to the unreached. And so they were the ones who helped me understand that there are things that I could do with the skills that God gave me, because I didn't think God gave me the skill set to be a preacher. Mm-hmm. I have never...
And now you are one.
So, yeah.
Sorry, we'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Growing up, I didn't like public speaking. I don't know anybody as a young person that enjoys it.
Yeah.
I wrestled with that.
Yeah.
So we get into college. We get out of college now in the story. And so now I'm wrestling with, what do I do? I've got a degree. At that time, the aviation industry was not doing very well.
Yeah.
There were a lot of Vietnam-era pilots that were in the airline industry. They were supposed to be retiring at any moment, but they weren't. There wasn't this promised...
They didn't need pilots, it
right.
sounds like.
They didn't need pilots. It was very difficult to get a job as a pilot.
Right.
And so I was doing some mechanicing work. I was working at a flight school kind of thing. So I had some time, and the Stanleys called me and says, "Hey, we're going back down to Ecuador to do this special project. We need some help. You want to come?" And I was like, yes. Yeah, sign me up.
You've just pulled my heartstrings.
Right. So I go back down to Ecuador. We get this project that was supposed to take 3 months. We wound up getting it done in about 3 weeks.
Oh.
It was disassembling a 1 megawatt shortwave transmitter, which is a big transmitter. Packing it up into Connex boxes to ship to the Seychelles Islands, which at that time I had to look it up on the globe to know where the Seychelles were.
I would have to look it up right now.
It's off the coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean.
Wow. Oh.
And so that's where this transmitter was going to go, and they needed some help. What they really needed was a strong back and a weak mind. And so that's why I went.
So they thought of you, huh?
They thought of me, yeah. So anyway, we get down there, we get that job done. We still got a lot of time in country. Mm-hmm. And so I start checking around, do some other projects. I go back up into the jungles to help at a power plant. They had a hydroelectric plant that actually powered the transmitters, and so I did some work there. That was a lot of fun. Wound up being at a Mission Aviation Fellowship base in Shelmera, which, if you're familiar with missionary aviation history, you know that that's where Nate Saint and those guys that were the martyrs.
Or if you've read Jungle Pilot.
If you've read Jungle Pilot, that was where they were based out of.
Yeah.
And they needed some help. They had a Cessna 185 that had run off the end of a runway, and they needed some help disassembling that airplane and helping to rebuild it. And I was like, sign me up. I'll go do that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I spent some time with MAF there in Ecuador. And at that time, this was the late 80s, early 90s. Mission Aviation Fellowship had a program, and I don't know if they still do or not, but they had a program where if you were on the field, you could do all your tech evaluations and your application process there on the field. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking, this is great. This is awesome. I'm having a wonderful time. I'm doing things where I see a tangible benefit for the kingdom. I have the skill set. I have the training. God, this is what you made me to do.
Like the puzzle has been completed.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And then governments and legal systems get in the way. My visa expired. Well, there was a way to get my visa renewed if I would just leave the country and I could reapply and come back in. Mm-hmm. It was suggested to me that I take a bus into Colombia and then come back in, and that they could give me the visa I needed and it'd be fine. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm just not comfortable, young American.
Naive about all this stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Getting on a bus, going through the Amazon jungle, going into Colombia, which at the time, the cartels and the cocaine trade and all that stuff were really bad. The Shining Path terrorist organization was running from Peru through Ecuador into Colombia. We could not be flying after dark if you flew after dark, the military would shoot you down.
Wow.
You may remember, some folks probably aren't old enough to remember, but there was a missionary plane shot down.
I did not know that.
Because
wow.
of that issue about that time frame. So anyway, I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I needed to come back to the States to do some other things anyway. So I said, okay, I'll go back to the States, get all this stuff sorted out, and I'm coming back. Well, I get back to the States, start working through the process. To MAF's credit, they wanted to make sure that I was really going to be a good fit for the organization. So said, hey, you're already back in the States. Let's go through the normal application process. You're no longer in the field. So started through that process, and it didn't go well.
Oh.
It was. It wasn't that I wasn't able to meet all the requirements. I could. I had all the recommendations from the guys on the field that they were like, no, we need him down here. He's great. He passed all the tech evaluation stuff. This is good. We want him back. It just, one example, I needed to have a recommendation from a college professor because I went through the program at LeTourneau. So I was a lab assistant for one of the professors. I'd reached out to him. He had been actually with JARS, which is from Wycliffe, Jungle Aviation Radio Service, in Indonesia. And so he was kind of my mentor when I was at LeTourneau. I was his lab assistant for a couple of years. We were close friends. And I called and reached out to him and said, hey, I this is what I'm trying to do. Would you be willing to write me a recommendation? And Mr. Nemo says, absolutely, I'll do that. Well, I don't hear anything from him. A couple of weeks go by, nothing. I'm thinking, well, maybe he's busy, whatever. Get to a month, and I'm like, I need to call him. So I call him, and then I know we're going deep into the weeds here, but I called him, and there was a lot of noise on the phone when his daughter answered. And I couldn't really hear and understand what she was saying. I asked him, and questioned if Mr. Nemo was there. No, it's just a kind of a short answer. And I was like, okay, well, I'll call him back later, and we hang up. I get to thinking a little bit, and she goes, and in my mind, I'm going, she didn't sound okay. When I called. So I called back the next day, and I got his wife. And I says, hey, I called last night. She goes, yeah, and we kind of talked through all that stuff. And she says, Mr. Nemo passed away 3 days ago.
Wow.
And so first of all, I felt like a jerk.
Right.
Because I'd called and talked to his daughter and couldn't understand what she said because of the phone connection. And so anyway, so that was a huge, I guess, setback in that whole process. And in the meantime, I had school loans that were coming due. I had to get something started with a paycheck or something, So then I was a flight instructor and a mechanic at a flight school in Dallas because I had to get a paycheck. And so during that time, in the back of my mind, I was like, I need to get back to Ecuador. I need to get back down there. That's where I want to be. I don't want to be here in Dallas. I just, was in Dallas for 3.5 years.
Well, that's a long time.
Yeah.
While your heart was somewhere else.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it was looking back on it now, some 30 years plus later, I can see what God was doing and why that happened. I consider that time to be the equivalent of me being Jonah in the belly of the whale.
How so?
I was wanting to do something different than what God wanted me to do. And at first I didn't understand that and realize it. And then it started to become evident to me that what I was wanting to do was not what God's plan was. And as long as I was pursuing my plan and not being sensitive to what God's leading was and what his plan was for my life, things were not going to go according to my plan.
Would you say, this is interesting, what you're saying. Would you say that at the time, and you realizing now, you can tell me if this is accurate, you were serving your own personal heart's desire. You wanted the adventure, the purposeful work, all of those things. And none of those are inherently bad.
No.
Those are all good things,
right.
But those are the things you were serving. It was not Christ himself.
And it would have been, well, I don't know that I want to go as far as to say that if I would have gone back to Ecuador, that it would have been God honoring, because I don't think it would have been on a deeper level, because it would not have been where God wanted me. Would I have been doing kingdom honoring, God honoring work? Yes, I would have been helping the advancement of the gospel in missionary work. It was not a bad thing to go do that, but it wasn't the perfect thing. And that's a very subtle difference between those things. It wasn't bad for me to have that desire to go do that. That's just not what God had for me.
So did you struggle with anger, like in that process? Angry at
there was definitely a lot of frustration, and it probably manifested itself in anger. Yeah. Yeah.
And would you say it was directed at God, at governments, at MAF, or everything above?
All of it.
Yeah. Okay.
All of it. So here's what happened. I was living by myself in an apartment in Dallas. Rent was not cheap. I was working at a flight school, managing a full load of students, not really making much money doing that, because at the time you just didn't make much money as a flight instructor.
Right.
In order to supplement my income, I was also the mechanic maintaining the 5 airplanes that the flight school had.
Wow.
And so I was trying to balance that load. That really wasn't enough for me to actually get ahead on paying my school loans and all of my bills. And I wasn't living a lavish lifestyle.
Right. Beans and rice.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, struggling guy right out of college, you know. And so I took another full-time job.
Wow.
At night, working for Cummins Engine Company in their parts department.
Wow.
And so what happened as a result of all that, I was getting about 4 hours of sleep a night.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. And so those of you who are pilots or flight instructors specifically, you need more than 4 hours of sleep to be able to be safe teaching people how to fly.
Yes, when you feel your eyes being heavy with a student next to you.
Not good.
Maybe not good.
It's not a good combination. I came to the realization, and this is going to sound kind of harsh, but as pilots we'll laugh at this, that a student's primary objectives in life is to wreck an airplane and kill a flight instructor.
Yes, I've heard something to that effect before.
And you need more than 4 hours of sleep to be able to survive that.
Prevent that, yeah.
Right, right. So that's when I finally got to the point. The other thing that was happening, Sundays was my only day off. And I desperately wanted to be going to church. But
and you desperately wanted to sleep.
And the problem was, if I sat still for more than 5 minutes on Sunday, it was lights out.
Yeah.
As much as I wanted to be in church, I physically could not stay awake.
Yeah.
And so there was that lack of Christian fellowship. There was, all the things that were pushing against me. And that's when I came to the realization, okay, God, I don't know where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be doing. I thought I knew. I thought I had a plan. I thought you wanted me back in Ecuador. That's not working. Because this whole time I'm trying to get back there. I'm trying to do all this stuff. Going
every
through
angle.
Everything I can do to work through this process, and it just wasn't happening. And I says, okay, God, I think I'm Jonah right now. You are going to have to spit me out on the beach that I am supposed to be on, because this is not the place for me. I'm going to have to rely on you to make it very obvious what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Can I just say I love your story, Adam, because a lot of people I've interviewed or just talked to over dinner, they always talk about their rock bottom moment.
That was mine.
And that was yours. But it's like every story I've heard, there's a rock bottom moment, and then God's like, okay, now you're ready.
Right.
You weren't ready before. But I needed to break you. Kind of like in the military, they break you and then they build you back up. I think it's like that.
Unfortunately, I've had more than one rock bottom moment in different areas of my life.
Well, you had a lot to learn, I guess.
Apparently, I am a slow learner in some areas. But that's where I was at that point.
Okay.
And so this was 1995. This was February 95. My lease was going to expire on my apartment in March. And I says, okay, God, I am not going to renew my lease on my apartment. I don't know where I'm going to be. I'm hoping and I'm praying that you will show me in the next 3 months.
Right.
Between January and March, this is where this is going to have to happen.
That's the end of the line. Yeah.
Right. And it's amazing what happened. I started getting job offers. I wasn't really looking at that point because I'd kind of given up on some things. I was trying to kind of network and find some opportunities, and they just didn't go anywhere. Now all of a sudden, people are starting to call saying, "Hey, you know," and I'm like, "Oh, this is kind of interesting." Well, then a college buddy of mine who lives in Kenai, and he and I actually, it's kind of funny. His last name is White, like mine. We're not related. Everybody in school thought we were at least cousins or something, but we weren't. I would always grill him about Alaska. And in college, I'd come to Alaska. I'd actually come to Glen Allen for 2 weeks to help at KIAM, the radio station in Glen Allen. And that was a dream trip of mine. Alaska had always had this draw and this allure to me. Again, as a young guy growing up in rural Georgia, the sense of adventure, the Jack London stories, all this stuff that a young boy would read, and then thinking, no, this is awesome.
Yeah.
So out of the blue, I hadn't talked to Nate in probably a year. He calls me, and it was in February, and he said, "Hey, are you still interested in coming to Alaska?" And I was like, "Well, you know, it's interesting. You should call right now because here's what's going on in my life." He goes, "Well, if you're interested, there's this radio station in Nenana." And I'm like, "Well, I have no idea where that is."
Like,
but
what's Nenana?
Right. It's in Alaska, so that's good enough for me. He says they need a pilot and a mechanic. I was like, "Well, what kind of airplane do they fly?" "Well, Cherokee 6. Just so happened that at the flight school we had a Cherokee 6. I'd spent a lot of time flying that airplane. I'd built up a lot of time doing that. And I said, "Oh, that's great." I says, "Well, send me the information. What do they pay?" He goes, No. This is a missionary thing. You have to raise your own support." And I was like, "Oh, well, actually," and so at that time, because I was working this other job, I was always working, only had 4 hours a night to sleep.
Right.
And Sunday was my only day off, and I slept all day. I didn't spend any money. And so I was able to save up some to pay ahead on school loans, had enough money at that point that I was able to basically live for 6 months without a paycheck.
Wow.
And so I says, "Okay, well," I called, we kind of talked, and I says, "Okay, I'll commit to 6 months because that's the amount of money I've got that I can."
How much money you have.
Yeah. And so they says, "Great, come on up. Love to have you." So I take everything out of the apartment in Dallas. I drive the 750 miles back to Georgia to store stuff at my parents' house. And the night before I get in the car to start driving to Alaska, a high school buddy calls me. He says, "My dad would like to talk to you." And I'm like, "Well, how did you even know I was home?" You know, he goes, "Well, we were calling your parents to see if they could tell us where you were," kind of thing. Well, his dad, they ran an air taxi with a fleet of DC-3s.
Wow.
That were flying from Georgia down to the Dominican Republic, and they needed a flight mechanic.
Wow.
And so he offered me a job right on the spot.
Wow.
As a co-pilot, flight mechanic. And I was like, if you'd have called me 2 months ago, I would have jumped all over it. I said, but I am literally, the car is sitting in the driveway packed. At 5 in the morning, I am driving to Alaska.
You're going the opposite direction.
Opposite direction. I mean, literally, from the Dominican Republic to Alaska, opposite corners of the continent.
Hemisphere. Right? Yeah.
And he says, "Well, what are you going to be flying?" I says, "Well, Cherokee 6. He goes, "You're not going to be flying like a Beaver or something?" I was like, "No, Cherokee 6. He goes, "Well, that's kind of boring."
And, thanks, because I fly a Cherokee 6.
Right. You know, and he goes, "Well, wouldn't you rather fly DC-3? I was like, "Yeah, I would actually." He goes, "Well, what are they paying you?" And I was like, "Well, actually, they're not paying me. I'm kind of paying them." He goes, "You're a fool. You're stupid for doing this. You're a fool." And I says, "Well, I can understand where you're coming from." I said, "But I made a commitment. This is where I'm going. I've told them I'm coming. I can't back out on that. Sorry, but I'm going to have to turn you down." So I come to Alaska. I'm here for 2 months. and I hear through the grapevine that that company got shut down.
Wow.
DEA got involved. They apparently were not coming back empty from their flights from the Dominican Republic. And so God protected me from that.
Yeah, dodged a bullet, so to speak.
Literally.
But it's something you were not trying to dodge. You would have jumped in front of that one.
And I tell that part of the story because things like that have happened numerous times in my life. Not quite as dramatic as a job opportunity that would have resulted in me being in prison.
Right.
But something I'll get to a point in my life where it's rock bottom. Like, okay, Lord, I'm fully surrendering.
Yeah.
I thought I had before, but I obviously didn't.
Yeah.
And just after that happens, there's this carrot that starts dangling in front. It says, are you sure that you've fully surrendered? Because there's this other opportunity that just presented itself that is an incredible thing. Are you sure that's what you want to do? Because you've got this opportunity over here now that's tempting me away from, and that is a reoccurring thing in my life.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. I'm trying. My brain is like processing that as you're saying it because it's so key. Because following Christ and His leading will often not make any sense.
Right.
And it like logistically or pragmatically, you're like you're not even getting paid. I'm paying them to work for them.
Right.
And you had you could have flown DC-3s.
Yep. And this guy said, he literally direct quote, he goes, "You're a fool." That still is burned into my brain.
I mean, all those scriptures talk about being a fool.
Right.
Are just come flooding in
when
you hear that. But now here you are in Nenana with 2 aircraft serving these camps and serving missionaries and communities in Central Alaska.
Yep.
And you have a very vibrant life.
It's God has been faithful.
Yes.
In spite of my weakness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the point, isn't it?
It is.
Scripture teaches over and over.
Yeah.
So we have maybe 5 to 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Let's talk about some of your current ministry now.
Sure.
I listed at the beginning pastoring a church. You have 2 aircrafts and a hangar to run.
Right.
The Master's Mission, I don't know much about that actually. You do the radio show. You fly for these camps. So let's talk about some of those on the Airmen's Association. Let's start with, the hangar, the Master's Mission hangar. Tell me about that and why does it exist? And
Sure. So because of our activities here at Voice for Christ Ministries, and I say here because we're actually in one of their studios.
We're actually in the studio. Yeah, they let us use it.
Yeah. We got to know a lot of the people who live remote in the state, a lot of people in the villages because of the remote outlets for the radio that are there. And there were some opportunities for ministry to occur because of personal relationships that got started.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to do a more personal, face-to-face type ministry. And I say we, Lindy and I, my wife and I. And Voice for Christ Ministries is a very important ministry partner with us now. But at that time, it was we couldn't stay here and do that kind of ministry. It was not right for us to say, you need to change what you're doing to accommodate what we feel like we're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. You serve us. Right. You do what we want.
That's not the way to do that.
Yeah.
And so, long story short, we became a part of the Master's Mission, which is another mission organization doing things around the globe that allows us to focus on a more personal relationship type ministry and then still partner with Voice for Christ Ministries in the radio stuff. So that's how the radio station and the radio program still is a part of what I do. Mm-hmm. But yet the 2 airplanes in the hangar are an outgrowth of needing to be able to be prepared at a moment's notice to go respond and help with logistical needs of other mission organizations or camps or going out and visiting and doing.
Yeah. And I remember you talking about a while back, maybe you can just spend a minute or 2 talking about it, a ministry to like pioneer type folks, people who want to live remotely, kind of off the grid kind of people, and you were pursuing them. Could talk about that for a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So that's what we wanted to do. now 24 years ago. And so because of that relationship, because the folks who listened to the radio that didn't have any other contact with the outside world, this was just as the internet was starting to really become
they
useful.
wouldn't have had that out there.
No,
just this radio.
The technology wasn't available at that point. So the radio was their contact with the outside world. And so we wanted to follow up that conversation that had started because of the radio. They would reach out either by letter or when they would come into town to resupply. So we got to know a lot of folks that way. And so at that point, I became probably the easiest way to describe that as a circuit riding preacher.
Yeah.
Where in the old days, they would have a mule or a horse, and they would go from place to place.
And in a circuit.
In a circuit.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we were doing for a while, and that was going good. That was great. A lot of believers there in the bush. A lot of folks that just wanted some fellowship, but on their terms. They got out of town because they didn't want to be around people, but it's nice to have somebody stop by and have a cup of coffee every now and then.
Yeah.
So that's what we did. And it got to where the believers that we were visiting with, the Christians, matured in their faith because of the relationships, not because of necessarily what we were doing, but because of just that discipleship that happens. They started acting like a church.
Wow.
Even though they were separated by huge distances from each other, they started to work together and support each other and pray for one another and come together as a group. And that's one of the things we did for a while, was to bring a group of people together physically once or twice a year instead of us just visiting individually. Yeah. And so the way I described that, that ministry grew beyond us to where the need for us to be physically part of all that stuff dwindled over time. Not that they still didn't crave the Christian fellowship. We miss visiting with a lot of our friends out there, but because we're busy doing other things, it's hard to go back to do that. Yeah. So that's when things started happening with Cochrane Hills Bible Camp and other places to kind of spring from that.
What an interesting thing, because the reason they're out there is to be by themselves. Right. And yet part of the Christian walk is to fellowship with other believers. And so you have that community. Right. And so what an interesting task. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah. And I will tell you, there were several of those folks that we know, they struggled with that.
Yeah, interesting.
They wanted to be removed from society, but yet understood that there was still that mandate, that they had the desire to still have that fellowship. Yeah. So that they wrestle with that still. So,
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
All right, talk briefly, and this is our connection point, is flying for Cochrane Hills Bible Camp. You've been doing it a lot longer than I have. Would you go back, and we're going to run out of time here, but we'll go a little longer. Talk about Cochrane Hills Bible Camp. How long have you been doing it, and how did that start?
I don't remember when I first started helping with that. And there's a lot of stories I could tell about how God brought those things together. But the short version is I knew Roger and Carol Huntington were at Cochrane Hills. I had kind of heard through the grapevine that they were looking for some help logistics-wise. And I had tried to reach out to Roger. Again, this was more than 10 years ago, probably 14 years ago.
Okay.
Communication was not as easy then as it is now.
Right.
There was a lot of back and forth that we kind of missed each other when he was in range to be able to send an email or receive one.
Right.
So I decided I'm just going to show up. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. When you just show up someplace.
Miss, you might say.
Right, it's hit and miss. We sat down. I actually had another friend of mine from here in Nenana came with me because he wanted to kind of help with some other things that he still has some great skills to help with. Great conversation with Roger and Carol. This was in the wintertime. I went out there in the mall on skis. And that's kind of where our relationship rekindled, because I'd met Roger years ago because of a men's rally in Huslia. I had helped a lot of logistics with that, and had visited with them in Galena when they were living in Galena for a while. I had some mechanical issues with the Cherokee one year, and so we knew each other kind of distant at that point, but then started progressively working more and more, helping them more and more, being able to do more.
Because I know that in the history of the camp, they used to take boats. They would boat all the kids in.
Yep.
And then Adam White shows up, and maybe we can start flying kids in. I know Roger flew kids in a bunch in the past. I don't know the whole story. I'm hoping to get their story next.
Yep.
But and now it's like a full-fledged, we're flying the folks in there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's been good. I really appreciate Roger and Carol.
Yeah.
I consider Roger to be a very close friend.
Yeah.
And a brother.
And
it's been great to see how God has been working in their life and in my life, and then how it works in both of our lives together.
Yeah. I can see you guys as an iron sharpens iron. And Roger's definitely that kind of guy. He will sharpen you.
Yep.
He's not afraid. He's not afraid to ask hard questions. Yes.
That's right.
He's called me out of the blue, and he's asked me some very probing questions, but it's good for me too.
Yep.
Good. Okay. So tell me briefly about the Airmen's Association. I've heard it described as the AOPA of Alaska.
That's probably a nicer way of describing it than the way I've described it in the past, is the country cousin of AOPA.
Wow, I'm not sure what I think about that. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
The Alaska Airmen's Association is a basically a membership-based organization here in Alaska for pilots, mechanics, aviation enthusiasts, and that's to protect, promote, and preserve general aviation in Alaska. So that's the propaganda on the website, and it's not propaganda, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
That's all the taglines of what that organization's about. I got involved, many years ago, 18 years ago. They were looking for a volunteer to serve on the board of directors. At that time, the board of directors were somewhat regional. They needed one for the northern region. So that's how I got involved, beyond just being a member. Served as a president for 4 years, served as a board member for 6. During that time, the government and legislative affairs activities of the organization was in its infancy, is probably the best way to say it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a passion of mine, is interfacing with the policy makers and the rule makers, and just helping them understand maybe what some of the unintended consequences are of what they would consider to be a good rule.
Yeah, and I got to say, it's been so fascinating hearing all of your thoughts on this. We won't go into the nitty-gritties, but just like the relationship between the FAA and general aviation, and the relationship between for-profit, nonprofit, all of these issues come together, and Airmen's Association is like a liaison,
right.
A group of spokespersons for general aviation, to keep general aviation going, alive, so the average Joe can fly his plane and go fishing.
Yep. You did a good job of summing that up. Yeah.
Well, man, maybe I should join the Airmen's Association and be a spokesperson.
You're not a member?
I am not.
I think the interview's done. I'm out of here.
I didn't know that was a requirement.
No.
Yeah.
So that's how I kind of got started with the Airmen's, and I really enjoy that kind of interaction. And again, it's from the perspective of, I understand the goal. I understand what we're trying to achieve. Let me explain to you why I think what we're doing is counterproductive. This may be a better way for us to think about this. Let's consider how this is going to impact this activity. So that's my goal. That's my intention. That's the way I present and attack these problems when I come into these things. And I will also say that because of my worldview, because I am a Christian, and because I understand what the Bible says about the worth of each one of us, and that we are all created in God's image. And when I am dealing with another person, I may not agree with them, but they are an image bearer of my Creator, because He was their Creator too.
Yeah.
And so it gives me something else to ponder and say, this person is not the problem.
Yes.
There are other things at play here. And so I don't want to say that gives me an advantage, that I know and understand and think that way. But I will say that God has blessed that attitude and that interaction with people, I try really hard not to come in hot and heavy and angry and forceful and say, you need to stop. Here's the reason why. We need to fix this. This is wrong. Mm-hmm. My flesh wants to do that.
Yes. Yes.
But when you come in and say, look, I know you have a job to do. Let me explain to you how we can do this together.
Yeah. That's so interesting. You've been talking about sort of, I'll use the term interface, an interface between general aviation and the FAA. But what you've broken that down even further to say, this is an interface between my worldview and the worldview of a lot of the people in the FAA that see things differently. Right. And that forms how they think about policy.
That's right.
And that's where some of the rub happens with the disagreements.
Right. And it's not a religious, non-religious kind of thing.
Yeah, I understand.
The FAA has a goal because they're federal government. They have a mandate to make sure that aviation is safe.
Yeah, yeah.
And on a certain level, the safest way to do aviation is to not do aviation. And there's a lot of people
just never take any risks in life, and you'll live through it and die in a nursing home.
You'll never have an aviation accident if you never fly in an airplane.
Right.
Now, is that practical? No, it's not. We all know that's not practical.
Yeah.
But to the FAA's credit, they even say that safety is not the absence of risk. Okay. There is a certain level of risk that's involved with everything that we do.
Right.
Especially in aviation. It's how do you manage and mitigate that risk?
Right.
How do you, and again, most of the policies, most of the rules, all the things that are coming down, it's the goal is to make it safer. But is that risk versus reward, is that in the proper balance?
Yes.
And
that, of course, comes down to personal opinions.
Exactly.
Worldviews.
Right.
Yes.
And data. So let me just be honest with some of it boils down to empirical data.
Yeah.
A lot of this discussion happens because I feel like it would be safer. Okay, I would disagree with that. I feel like it would be safer to do this versus that. Mm-hmm. Well, then now we have to go back and look at, what does the data tell us?
Yeah.
And so all these things are going through my mind when I'm working these issues for the Airmen's Association. Mm-hmm. And I try really hard to keep my personal emotions out of it.
Yeah.
Which is difficult sometimes, I'll admit. Mm-hmm. But I do think that I think God has prepared me because of all the areas in my life that I'm involved with, the different things that I'm doing. And then God has blessed me with being able to understand and at least think that, okay, this is another image bearer of Christ.
Yes.
Those are the things that go through my mind when I'm doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people that I deal with are not Christians.
Right.
They're just not. And
they're not believers, but they are trying to make safe policies to help all pilots be safer. Right. But there's disagreements in the nitty gritties.
Right. And I don't sit there and preach a sermon to them.
Right.
I don't, there's a lot of times when most of those people know who I am and what I do.
Yeah.
So I don't have to say a lot of those things because they know that already.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have to be careful in the government sphere. Mm-hmm. A lot of people think religion should never come up in conversation when it comes to government. Mm-hmm. So I try to be sensitive to those things, but I also have an obligation to live out my faith. Mm-hmm. And how does that happen, and what does that look like as you go along?
Yeah, it's just such an interesting intersection between your faith and governmental policy.
Right.
We don't normally think that way, but there is definitely overlap.
Sure.
Because you're talking about government policies, worldview is inevitable.
Right.
Yeah.
It does shape the way you think the world operates.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Adam, I feel like we could talk for another hour because we still haven't gotten to the church that you pastor. We haven't talked much about your three daughters and what they're up to. And those are episodes in of themselves. And of course, the Cochrane Hill stuff that you and I do together, we could tell some flying stories. Yep. We talked about earlier today, I had to dodge around a storm and it was lightning and everything.
Yep, which people may have heard the thunder clap.
Yes.
A few minutes ago, right?
A lot of building of cumulus clouds out there right now, and I got to fly back to camp here this afternoon. So anyway, a lot more content there, but I think we need to end it here. Adam, thank you for coming on. I feel like I learned a few new things about you and a good sense of where your heart is. And I learned a few new things and some things to contemplate. So thank you for coming on the show, and hopefully I'll have you on again pretty soon.
I've enjoyed it. It's good to talk.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
See you, Bill.